So when I was a student at the University of Toronto, I had an Islamic theology class that I took that was taught by a woman imam. That's incredibly rare in the Muslim world. In fact, it really only happens in the West where you'd have a woman who's an imam, who would be a leader of a prayer service, would lead an ummah, a community of Muslims. And I had a friend of mine in that class, a young Hanbali Muslim guy, and we were talking about the nature of philosophy and theology. We were studying Islamic theology together, and we were talking about how does that relate to how we do theology. Well, I remember at one point talking about the importance of reason and truth, which is something that Muslims have thought very carefully about. I said to my friend, "Well, of course, you're a Muslim and I'm a Christian. We can't both be right, and we might both be wrong." And this young man was a postmodern thinking kind of guy. Looked at me and looked at me like I was speaking German to him all of a sudden. What are you talking about? Of course we can both be right. And I realized that I wasn't just talking to a Muslim who maybe came straight out of the Middle East. This is a Western postmodern Muslim. Postmodernism is a tricky thing, and we're going to talk about what that means tonight. But this whole idea that two people could believe contradictory beliefs and they could both be right is perfectly at home in postmodern philosophy. So, does postmodern philosophy defeat natural theology? Well, let's talk about what natural theology is. So, from the perspective of Christian theology, natural theology looks at the world and says God has spoken in the world. God's revealed himself in the natural world, in the human conscience, in logic itself. And of course, God has revealed himself maybe most definitively in the scriptures. So the first category we call general revelation, and the second category we call special revelation. We importantly don't call the first category natural revelation. That's an important distinction because Jesus was born in the natural world. Jesus was a human who had a natural body. And so we don't want to say that one is natural and one is special. One is general, given to all peoples at all times, and one is special, given to particular peoples at particular times. Well, natural theology says, okay, well, let's look at what is given to all peoples at all times. What knowledge of God could there possibly be in the world? And that general revelation is examined using reason, using the sciences, to determine what the truth is about God, at least as far as we can know it generally. That's natural theology. It typically comes to us in the form of arguments for the existence of God. My guess is you've probably learned if you've been around this club for very long. Well, why would somebody care about this? Why would somebody care about natural theology? Well, if you're a Christian, you care about it because you have skeptical friends that you would like to be able to talk to about the existence of God. It might be helpful for you to have some evidence to offer for the existence of God. If you're not a follower of Jesus, or maybe you have some skeptical questions yourself, natural theology might be helpful for you because it might be helpful for you to understand that there are public reasons that you could have for becoming a theist or maybe even a Christian. That is, that you're not just expected to take a leap into the dark, hoping that God's there to catch you, but maybe there are some reasons that you could consider that could help you to examine whether or not belief in God is rational. Well, another reason that natural theology is valuable is that there are religious people, Christian people, who have doubts from time to time. They wonder whether or not their faith is true. They may have had some bad experience or heard a good counter argument against Christianity and have thought, well, do I really know this? Do I really know that this is true? Natural theology can be helpful for those people. It can help to strengthen their faith and say, hey, wait a minute, even if I don't feel like it, this might actually be true. So natural theology has some value. And yet postmodernism rejects natural theology. Why? Well, I'll tell you why. Let's start with what is postmodern philosophy. I'm most at home talking about philosophy. Whenever Donald asks me to talk, I hope that he doesn't ask me to talk about science, because you guys know more about that than I do. But I'm really at home talking about philosophy. Postmodern philosophy is a little nutty, though. I encourage you, if you have questions while I'm doing this, write them down. I want to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. But we'll talk about some key figures in postmodern philosophy now. The first person I want to talk about is Jacques Derrida. There's some good French names today. I'm going to practice my accent. Jacques Derrida. He said that there is nothing outside the text. And what he meant by this was that whenever you read something or you hear somebody speak, you are receiving a text. Even if somebody's talking to you or you're reading something, it's a text. you're watching a movie, it's a kind of text. So what he said is that there's nothing outside the text. That is, when you read something or hear something, there's no original author intended meaning for you to get at. All there is the text itself. That is, whatever the author was intending, whatever the speaker was meaning when he or she spoke, is completely lost to you. There's no way to recover the intention behind a text. Meaning, therefore, is determined as much by the reader or listener as it is by the speaker or the writer. That might sound a little bit crazy to you, but think about this. How many times have you misunderstood somebody who said something to you? All right, how many times has somebody said something and you'd be like, I have no idea what you mean by that? Well, that's what he's getting at here. He's getting at the fact that humans have difficulty communicating. And so what Derrida would say is that logic is valid. So logic as a way to discover truth, that's one valid pathway, but there are some things that transcend logic. It's possible to deny logic. I can do it right now. There's no such thing as logic. See, I just did it. So logic may not be all that there is. In fact, logic might just be one way of talking about the world. And there are other ways to talk about the world. For Derrida, religious faith, and he wasn't a particularly religious man, but he said that religious faith, whatever that is more about a relationship with a person than it is about knowing the truth. That's something that's really interesting for Christians to consider, because Christians tend to believe that it's important to know Jesus and not just know about Jesus. Okay? But what he's saying is that faith is more about relationship than it is about knowledge. Well, let's look at Jean-François Lyotard. That's my next French thing I get to say. Lyotard, he was a French Canadian. Well, he was French, but he wrote in Canada. And his famous line is that postmodernism is incredulity to meta-narratives. Well, what the hell does that mean? So incredulity to meta-narratives. Incredulity is like doubtfulness. It's that you doubt meta-narratives. If you are a postmodern person, which Lyotard said that many people are in our culture, if you're a postmodern person, you will doubt meta-narratives. Well, what is a meta-narrative? It's not just a big story. There are a lot of big stories. Christianity is a big story. For Derrida, for Lyotard, a meta-narrative is a big story that legitimizes itself by reference to universal reason. So what he had in mind was the big story of what he called techno-scientific naturalism, where everything can be reduced to knowledge that can be backed up by reason. And so it's a whole system. It's a big story that it can explain everything about life and humanity in the world by referring to reason, ultimately. Another kind of meta-narrative that Lyotard was critical of is Hegelianism. Hegel was a German philosopher who talked about how reason itself actually explains to us what the meaning of history is. Hegel, of course, was footnoted by Marx. A modern critical race theory is a descendant of Hegel as well. So it looks at the universe as being reducible to rational principles alone. Well, if that's the case, if we're incredulous to meta-narratives, then whenever somebody's using reason to talk about truth, especially religious truth, that means that you're trying to legitimize whatever your religious beliefs are by referring to reason, ultimately. And postmoderns will be incredulous to that. They will be doubtful of that, Lyotard would say. Lyotard was a student of Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein talks about how there's no ultimate story for us to understand. There's no truth for us to get at. All we have are the little truths that define how we live and work in our own little communities of practice. One community of practice for Wittgenstein is the scientific community. When you do experiments, you're working inside of what he would call a game. And in this game, there are rules to the game. You play by the rules of the scientific community. However, when you leave your work in a lab and you go to your religious community, there's a different set of rules that apply there. There's ways that you use words. What you mean by truth is different in a religious community than it is in a scientific community. But there's no ultimate overarching community that can govern all the rules in all the games. It would be like this. If I was telling you to step into the batter's box and to get ready for the pitch, and you went like this, you'd say you're doing it wrong. You're not playing the game correctly. You're getting ready to play hockey right now. You got to do it right, and you teach people the rules of the game. Well, that's exactly how truth works for Wittgenstein. There is no capital T truth. There's just how you talk about the truth in your little groups. Well, if that's the case, natural theology is kind of meaningless. Because if I wanted to talk to you about the existence of God, and I want to use reason to do so, and let's say you're a skeptic, I'm speaking to you from my little language game community as a Christian, and you're in your own community, whatever that is. If you're, let's say you're a Buddhist or you're a skeptic, you're part of your own little community. There's no way for me to communicate the truth to you. Because the truth for me could never possibly be the truth for you. You would literally have to leave your community and come and learn the rules in mine before you would even understand what I mean by the phrase, God exists. You don't even understand what I mean when I say that God exists. So another thing from Lyotard is he was a proponent of epistemic pragmatism. Epistemology has to do with knowledge. Pragmatism has to do with some sort of utility or practical value. That is, knowledge is not what can be known to correspond to reality, but knowledge is just what works. If you have knowledge, that means you've been successful with whatever your theory or idea is. Truth is what gets stuff done. Natural theology tries to tell you what the truth is using reason, but it's not true unless it works, regardless of how reason supports it. So you see this in our culture. Speak your truth, right? Heard that one before? Well, if you're speaking your truth, you're an epistemic pragmatist. You're doing what works for you. Hey, whatever works for you is great. Well, what if it works for me to do bad things? We won't talk about that right now. Okay. So how has postmodern philosophy affected how people talk about God? One of the most important theologians and philosophers for this is a man named Paul Ricoeur. He said that when people use religious language, even language like God exists, they're not really describing the world as it is. All they're doing is imagining a world that makes sense to them as a religious person. So when I say God exists, I'm not telling you how things are. I'm more like painting a picture. And isn't that a beautiful picture? Right? You see how it's kind of like, hey, this is inspiring. And people in our culture talk about religion this way. Well, that's a really beautiful thought. Yeah, I remember. So there's been times where I've shared my faith with people in the tech industry, and they're like, "Oh, that's really beautiful." And when I'm sharing my faith with them, I'm trying to tell them what's true. It happens to be beautiful because it's true, but it being beautiful is not enough. Paul Ricoeur also said that the most important kind of belief is not believing that, but it's believing in something. Believing that is the kind of knowledge that you have about science. I believe that water is H2O. But the most important kinds of beliefs are when you believe in a person. It's more of like an existential belief. It's something that requires all of who you are. There's nothing at risk with you affirming the truth that water is H2O. There's nothing at risk there. But the most beautiful kinds of beliefs cost you something. They require you to step out and to have some kind of faith or trust in them. Merold Westphal, a postmodern theologian, says that we don't have access to objective knowledge because we're finite. Anybody want to deny that you're finite? You don't know everything. So who are you to claim that you have objective knowledge? That is, that you know how things really are in the world. Westphal says that all human thought requires a kind of faith and cannot deliver certainty. Sometimes you act like you're certain, but that's just pride. But really, you're fallible. You make mistakes. For Westphal, natural theology is guilty of a particular kind of sin too. And Westphal, speaking as a Christian here, he says natural theology is guilty of the sin of ontotheology. There's a weird word, ontotheology. This is where whenever you talk about God using philosophical concepts, you're trying to control who God really is. You're trying to take God and make him an item of philosophical discourse. And God is wild. God is something that you can never get your mind fully around. And when you take him and make him an item of philosophical discourse, you're treating him like a beaker in a lab. How dare you? So whenever you do natural theology, you come to the conclusion through an argument that God exists. You're really just trying to control the concept of God. You're making him your own. That's what Westphal would say. In natural theology, because you use reason to do it, means that reason is actually more important than God to you. So you actually are turning reason itself into an idol. You shall have no other gods before me, the Ten Commandments say. Well, postmodernism tells us that that's actually idolatry. So, how exactly do postmoderns reject natural theology? I've given you some clues already, but I did my doctoral research on this very question, actually. So let's talk a little bit about this. Postmodern philosophy first rejects the use of universal reason. Universal reason. One of the things that I love about arguments for the existence of God is that if you're a skeptic and I'm a believer, we can have a good conversation about it. That is, that we can look at a set of data and we can use reason to investigate the data together, and we may come to some different conclusions, but we're on the same playing field, right? There's common ground between us, is a way that a lot of people have talked about. I love that about natural theology. As if you don't believe and I do, we can have a good conversation about it because we're talking about facts that we both could at least examine together. Well, postmodern philosophy thinks that that's impossible. There's no such thing as universal reason. For one, there's no public knowledge of God that's revealed generally. Postmodernism actually denies general revelation. They don't think that God has spoken, because even if God has, who are you to say that you've heard it? That's arrogance, right? Reason and truth, by the way, they work differently depending on which language game community you're in. So even Christian postmoderns like James K.A. Smith would say, hey, look, you're in your little Christian language game community. The way that you use truth is different from how somebody else uses it. The way that you use reason is different than how somebody else uses it. Who are you to say that you're doing it right and they're doing it wrong? Another reason that postmodernism rejects universal reason is that whenever you're doing natural theology or apologetics, you're attempting to legitimate Christianity by reference to universal reason. Think about why this could be a problem. If I wanted to say to you, I know that Christianity is true, and I say, and reason proves it, that's a little bit backwards, right? Because what really proves whether or not Christianity is true? Facts prove Christianity true. And God is the one who knows the facts. So when I say that I'm using reason to legitimate it, then really what I'm doing is I'm saying I actually have something better than God's point of view. See what the postmoderns are saying here? I actually know better than you. So you're trying to legitimate Christianity by reference to universal reason, and postmodernism is incredulous to this way of thinking about things. Well, I think the postmoderns are wrong. And I'll say why. Think about reason for a second. When you use the laws of thought, think of the law of non-contradiction. A does not equal non-A. This is kind of the bare bones of how you look at the world, right? If, for example, this law, the law of non-contradiction, let's just look at it as a law. A does not equal non-A. I put that in your notes if you want to look at it, what that looks like. Imagine if I were to say to you, the law of non-contradiction is false, which is what these guys are saying. Do you see how you need the law of non-contradiction to even affirm its truth or falsity? If you deny it, you're actually affirming it. You see what I'm saying? Some of you, I'm seeing like every now and then somebody's going. Some of you are getting it. Because when you say like the law of non-contradiction is false, you're saying it's not the same as its denial. Or it's not the same as its affirmation. So you have to affirm the law in order to deny it. Yes, go ahead.
Just reject the laws of logic. What prevents someone from doing that?
Yeah. Well, it depends what you mean by rejecting. What do you mean by rejecting?
I could just say that, like, I don't agree with the law of non-contradiction, for instance. I just don't hold to it. So anything can be true or false doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Obviously, somebody's within their moral rights to reject it, but saying I don't hold to it is different than saying it's false. The postmodern is just saying that it's false. What you're suggesting is a third option of something like I don't like it. Or correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. I mean, if you accept logic, it's possible to. You can't say logic is false if you're making a propositional statement.
But even if you say I don't like it, then that actually is trading on the law of non-contradiction as well. Because if I said, oh, so you like it? You say, no, I don't like it. Oh, so liking it is not the same as not liking it. And that appeals to the law of non-contradiction.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? The law of non-contradiction, what I would suggest to you, you can't get away from it. And I know that Aristotle, who's dead white guy, European of all things, he was the one who codified this. But he didn't make it up. He codified it. He discovered it. And he wrote it down. And like, that doesn't mean that white European men are the best at everything. It just means that like Aristotle stumbled across something that was important. Yeah, go ahead.
What if I say that the law of non-contradiction is true, but so is its negation?
Oh. That's trading on the law as well, because you're affirming as a set. So this goes to set theory in philosophy. Set theory is where you can make a conjunctive statement of like A and non-A in this case, or like A and B is typically more common in set theory. So you're like A and B is true, or it is the case that A and B. Well, if you have a set like that, then you can examine it as a set. So you say like I affirm its affirmation and its denial, and I could say, well, there you also deny its affirmation and its denial.
I do.
Because the set can be yeah. And there now you're in a vicious regress, and you have to suffer the consequences of saying something that's really nonsensical. Yeah.
Maybe it's totally nonsensical because.
It depends what you mean by impractical. If it's like it sucks to be in a vicious regress, yeah, that's impractical. But it's also like you think about everything that's meaningful that you get done in life. Everything trades on this, you know. Stop at red lights. Oh, so I stop at the green ones. Oh, go on the green lights. Oh, so I want to go on the red lights. It's like it doesn't work that way, right? Even for practical purposes. We all obey the law of non-contradiction all the time because it's central to how we think. Even if I was to say to you, God exists, and you say God does not exist, then that requires for one of us to be wrong, right? Now, there could be a third option. There could be like maybe the Buddha, which is more or not the Buddha, like a concept of nirvana in Buddhism, which is sort of impersonal. That could be another option. Right? But in that case, God does not exist, right? So the God exists, God does not exist. One of those is true and one of them is false. And that's the law of bivalence, which is a corollary of the law of non-contradiction. So, okay, let's keep going here. And we can come back to that if you want. So I've been thinking about my Muslim friend, right? I said to him, hey, look, like, of course, we can't both be right, and we might both be wrong about this stuff. And he was like, what are you talking about? Well, when the Muslim says there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, because of what Muhammad prophesied, that means Jesus is not Lord. So if the Muslim is correct, then I'm wrong. That's okay. It doesn't mean that he doesn't like me. It doesn't mean that he like wants to be mean to me. It just means that if Islam is true, Christianity is false. That's a weird situation, but that's how it is. Now we might both be wrong, right? There could be something else that's true. Maybe like the secular humanists are right. But we can't all be correct, and that's really what this is saying. Paul Griffiths, he's a philosopher of religion taught at Duke for years. He actually did an empirical study looking at how different religions argued about truth. And he was looking at this idea of of logic being like male and Western. He's like, oh, you have your logic, your male Western logic. Well, he actually looked at other religions and how people in India argue about religion is the same way that Westerners argue about it. They use the law of non-contradiction when they argue about religious truth. And in fact, when they argue about religious truth with Westerners, they appeal to the law of non-contradiction. Right? It's at the core of what we do when we evaluate other belief systems. We use logic to do this. Now, truth doesn't mean, talking about truth, that doesn't mean that you are necessarily disrespectful to other cultures. In fact, if you're using logic to understand somebody else's beliefs, to me, that means you're taking an interest to be respectful about what somebody believes. I think it's incredibly disrespectful to Muslims to treat them like they need to be religious pluralists to be good Muslims. Oh, when you say that there's no God but Allah, of course you mean that it's true for you and it's not true for me. That actually misunderstands Islam. And it's actually, to me, that's a little bit patronizing to say about somebody else's religious faith, oh, you mean that that's true for you. That's not what they believe. They believe that it's true. So let them believe that. Respect that that's what they believe. Right? Same thing for the skeptic. Somebody who's like, well, I'm just not convinced by arguments for the existence of God. Oh, well, that's nice for you. No, just that's what they think. They have some reasons for it. Investigate what those are and be respectful about it. Another reason I think that that postmodernists are wrong about the use of reason is that when as Christians we use reason, we're doing it we're using it as a tool that's God given, and we're using it to discover knowledge. We're not using it to legitimate Christianity. That's an important thing. Christians start, and I'll talk more about this later, we start from the principle that God has spoken, that God has revealed himself. That is, that God has given us knowledge, and he's given us tools to discover it. So when I use reason to talk about God, that's not me trying to control the concept. That's not me trying to get my hands around him to make sure that he looks good enough for me. It's actually me just using a tool to try to understand the knowledge that he's revealed. All right, the second reason that postmoderns reject natural theology is their view of truth and their view of things called propositions. This is going to be fun here. It's not prepositions. I'm not giving you a grammar lesson here. Propositions, truth and propositions. So as we've talked about already, postmodernism asserts a kind of epistemic pragmatism. Truth is what works. The truth is what works. So whenever we talk about truth, that means that for us, we're not really talking about understanding God. We're trying to relate to God. We're trying to do something with it. When I say that Jesus is Lord, and I affirm that that's true, what I mean by that is that I'm trying to relate to Jesus. On postmodern philosophy and theology, I'm not saying that it is a fact that Jesus is Lord. That, for a postmodern, actually strips it of all of its power. It's just, oh, you're just affirming facts. Anybody can do that. Any scientist can say, oh, these are the facts, these are the facts. But the most important kind of truths are truths that do something. And that's what postmodernism trades in, is that you can actually have a relationship with somebody, that your beliefs transform you. And isn't that the most important thing? Think about our culture for a second here. It doesn't matter what you believe so long as you sincerely believe it. Right? That's how people think about religious belief. That as long as you're just sincere and you try, that's what transforms you. That's the beauty of faith. And for people who don't have faith, their non-belief has a way of transforming them as well, and they become the people that they want to be, and that's a beautiful thing. At least that's how postmodernism talks about it. Truth helps us to relate to God in our communities. Remember those little language game communities? In our little way of talking about God, it helps us to relate to God and thereby to relate to one another. And isn't that the beauty of religious faith? Postmoderns also, they reject propositions. Propositions are interesting things. I've been trading in them all night long. A proposition is a mental thing. In cultures that don't have elephants, you can explain to them what elephants are. They're like, okay, well, imagine a bear. But it's a little bit different than a bear. Imagine a bear with big ears and a lot less hair. Okay, all right, got my head around it. All right, so this elephant, this thing I'm talking about, it's like a bear that has big ears and a little bit less hair. and it's got this really long, like a rope-like tail. You know the ropes? You've seen the ropes before. It kind of looks like one of those. And it stands on all fours. You know, so bears sometimes stand up. Elephants hardly ever do that. They do it sometimes, but hardly ever. They're mostly walking around like this. And you know how the bear has this kind of like snout thing? Well, imagine that snout was just like as long as that tree trunk, and it's just as long as this, about this long. And that's about how long it is. And it can sniff up stuff there, can blow it out through there, can pick things up at the end of it. Well, that's an elephant. Oh, okay. You can explain what elephants are to cultures that don't have elephants. Well, people do this by referring to propositions. Propositions are ideas, and propositions are what declarative statements assert. So I'll give you an example of a proposition. Jesus is Lord. This is an idea, right? Can I communicate that proposition in another language? Anybody know how to say that in another language in this room? Nobody's bilingual? Yes. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I've never had somebody use American Sign Language. Thank you very much. So there's a different way to encode that idea, and encoding is kind of a key thing in postmodernism. Remember Derrida? There's nothing outside the text. When you write something down, or when you encode it in a physical sign, or you give it an acoustic blast, like I did, when you do that, you're taking an idea that's in your mind and you're putting it someplace physical. Piece of paper, acoustic blast, some kind of gesticulation. Okay. Now, when you see that, if you're a speaker of that language, you receive that text and you investigate it. Wait a minute, who is this Jesus person? I could say, oh, yeah, let me tell you about Jesus. Okay, so he's God. And what else do you know about him? He's Jewish. And he's man, he's God, lived in Palestine about 2,000 years ago. And he had like this mother who's like kind of a big deal. And his dad was like, not really his dad, but kind of his dad. And I can explain the idea to you a little bit more and you can get on board with it. This whole time, I'm using ideas that are in my mind and I'm giving them to you for you to hold in your mind. Propositions are ideas that people can share. And guess what? Propositions work. They do a really good job. So on postmodern grounds, propositions actually, they do the job. But they also seem to be required for any kind of meaningful communication. Now, on postmodernism, if there's nothing outside the text, remember, go back to Derrida, then you cannot hold in your mind the same idea that I have in my mind. So when I talked about Jesus being Lord or the existence of an elephant, you have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. Now, what you have is your own interpretation of what I'm talking about. You have your way of understanding it. I don't know if you've ever heard of people talking about this before as deconstruction. Not deconstructing your faith, but they talk about deconstruction. It's a literary movement where whenever you're hearing me say something or watching somebody gesticulate thusly or reading something in a text, your mind is literally changing the meaning. This is why sometimes you'll see feminist readings of Chaucer queering Shakespeare. Have you ever seen these show up in literature departments before? Like a Marxist reading of, I don't know, Dickens, thinking of another author. These kinds of courses show up because the idea is that whatever the authors meant is completely lost to us. So even I, as a speaker, explaining to you the lordship of Jesus, you will never understand what I mean by that because you're deconstructing whatever it is that I'm saying. The propositions that are in my mind will not be in your mind. So therefore, there's no correct interpretation of the world. There's just different takes. It's different views. Right? There's no truth. There's only truths. You should speak your truth and I should speak mine. We can't even understand each other anyway on postmodernism. So what's a response to that? Well, think of this idea of truth is what works, the pragmatic theory of truth. Truth is what works. Did you know that actually requires the correspondence theory of truth? The correspondence theory of truth is basically this. A proposition is true if and only if it corresponds to reality. Right? So if I say that, Saturn has, how many moons does Saturn have? Like 12?
A lot.
Yeah. So Venture a number. 9. Let's say 9. Okay. Maybe it's more. So if I say Saturn has 9 moons, that's a proposition. That statement is true if and only if, lo and behold, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay? That's the common way of looking at truth, right? Anybody like look at truth differently? That's how everybody looks at truth. Well, the pragmatic view actually requires the correspondence truth, the correspondence theory. Think about the proposition. Truth is what works. Well, that's only the case if truth is what works, if that's the fact of things. Well, sometimes the truth is really inconvenient, right? Sometimes the truth sucks. You know what I mean? Like, it is true that there is a pandemic. Well, that sucks. That screwed up a lot of things for me. That truth didn't actually work out very well for me. Did a lot of bad things in my life, right? When I believed in the pandemic, I realized that it screwed up a lot of my plans. That didn't work for me. Do you see what I'm saying here?
You equivocated on works.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
You equivocated works. That,
how so is what I'm asking.
You said truth is what works. I think that in the original statement you meant truth is what truth is like what is functional, but in the second one means that truth is what is enjoyable.
So yeah, what you're suggesting is that there's two different kinds of works at play here.
Yeah.
One is a matter of function, and the other is a matter of more satisfaction.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So Richard Rorty is the main component of this view, epistemic pragmatism. And for him, the utility of a proposition is not reducible to some kind of like scientific function. It's reducible to like whatever it is that's being considered. So something like religion, it doesn't have to work in the sense of it got me to heaven. It works in the sense of it gave me whatever it is I was looking for. And so working in that sense could be a sense of satisfaction. So I understand your suggestion that it's equivocation. I disagree. You had your hand up as well.
Oh, I was just saying it's an inconvenient truth. It turns out Saturn has 83 named moons and probably like 103.
All right, so that proposition was false. Hurts a lot. Okay, let's keep going here. The absolute rejection of objectivity is self-refuting. Consider the statement, there are no objective truths. That is self-refuting and false. Yeah.
Qualification. This is the only objective truth. Continue. That's recursive.
What's I'm not sure why that's relevant. I'm calling you out on a non sequitur.
You said there is no objective truth, but that's obviously self-refuting. But so you could formulate the same principle better by saying this is.
Yeah, of course you could. That's not what they claim. Because who are you to claim to know what the truth is? Right? You're finite. Remember this? Like you're finite. You don't know the game above the game. So when you say there is only one objective truth, that's claiming privileged knowledge that as a subject, as a finite subject, you simply don't have access to. That's the challenge here. Also, postmodern philosophy, it relies on propositions to communicate its theories. As I've been explaining to you, and I really have tried, I spent a lot of time reading the primary texts on postmodernism. I really wanted to understand them. And guess what I found out? They don't like it when you misunderstand them. Yeah. If you misinterpret postmoderns, they'll come back to you and say, you misinterpreted. Well, that's kind of ironic, right? Because couldn't I just respond by saying, well, this is my reading. This is how I read it. This is my view of it. I'm Ike Shepherdsoning this text, right? This is how I look at it. But this means that postmodernism trades on propositions, even in their denial of propositions. Consider the statement, there are no such things as propositions. How are we supposed to understand that statement? Am I supposed to understand it the way that you intended it? Am I supposed to hold in my mind the idea that's like unto the idea that you had in your mind prior to encoding it into a text? Purportedly, I should be able to do what you're doing and understand it the way you understand. Okay, so how do Christians actually do natural theology? I think postmodernism is absurd. I think there's reasons to reject it. Here's what I like about it, by the way, before I go into it. It does help us to be a little bit more humble about how we communicate with people. Postmodernism reminds you that you could be wrong. You've been wrong before. You'll likely be wrong again. And it's good for us to kind of have that attitude. Sometimes in natural theology, we can be a little bit triumphant. And I've come to the knowledge that God exists. And you can feel really good about yourself. Right? Well, postmodernism reminds you, hey, couldn't you be wrong about that? That's a good thing. Okay, so how can Christians do natural theology? Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to mess up your flow.
No, go for it.
How do they respond to that simple thing that it's self-defeating? To me, it's obvious that it's self-defeating because they wrote a book trying to convince you of your position.
Yeah.
Using language and logic, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so I mean, when somebody says something like there are no objective truths, I think the way to respond to that is say something like, well, okay, let me see if I understand the claim that you're making.
But how do they explain themselves?
How do postmodernism explain this? Oh, yeah. Okay. I didn't even talk about this. Yeah. Postmodernism has a concept. Let me back up here. Postmodernism started as a literary theory. So the people who were doing this initially were not philosophers. And actually, if you look at philosophy departments around the United States and Europe today, postmodernism is mostly dead. Guess where it's alive and well? Theology departments and English departments. People love it in those places. But in philosophy, it's basically a dead movement. That's why when I told my philosopher friends that I'm interested in this stuff, they're like, why? Because theologians care about it. That's why. That's what I would say. So it being a literary movement, they developed very early on a concept of irony. So when they say things like there are no objective truths, they understand that that's ridiculous. The theologians who read them don't understand that. So like Merrill Westphal doesn't get how silly this is, but like Derrida knew how silly this was. And they like to play into that. Well, I believe it because it's absurd. And they'll read people like Kierkegaard and say, like, isn't this the most beautiful thing about religion? Is that it's absurd, and that's why you believe it. I'm gonna enjoy how foolish this all is. And what they would say is that you techno-scientific minded people are no less foolish, because what are you doing? What are you producing and making that will be the hope of the world? Machines. And guess what machines are doing? Destroying lives again and again. In the wake of the atomic bomb, these people would say, the Western techno-scientific worldview has come to an end. Because they believed, Westerners believed, that science would lead us to progress, which would save humanity. And you can even look at this today in the transhumanism movement. People who they look at and I'm not an expert on this at all, but they look at ways to physically modify and improve your bodies to keep yourself alive, like bionic organs and things like that. The whole idea is that technology will make it so that we never die. Ted Williams, baseball great, when he died, he had his body frozen, his head frozen actually, to be resuscitated through technology later on. And if you know how great of a hitter Ted Williams was, that could be kind of a cool thing if that worked out. You know? But yeah, so the idea here is that like the techno-scientific way of thinking has failed. So in good postmodernism or postmodern irony, they'd say, hey, maybe we don't have it quite right yet, but you definitely don't. Because what have our views done? They've played with the fact that of the silliness about truth and falsity. Your views have destroyed civilization in Japan. And at the time, threatening nuclear war across the world. So that's what I'd say.
Too long, so make it right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, you're totally right. Yeah. I think it's what I've heard postmodern people say about this is that we have to live with the tension, knowing that we cannot know.
Quote Norman Geisler.
Yeah.
That's a nothing but argument. You know, there's nothing but this, what did you say earlier? There's no overarching meta narratives. There's nothing but your little narratives. Mm-hmm. That assumes a higher view of everything, that you know that.
Yeah.
How do they?
Yeah. They would, I think they would say, I'm playing with the word knowledge. They'd say, I'm not actually trying to communicate things that I know. I'm playing with the concept, ironically. They're not trying to resolve the tension that you feel. And if you feel weird about this, you should. This is weird stuff. But they would kind of play into that. Yes, go ahead.
They're not philosophers, they're like writers.
Yeah. So this is actually interesting. If you want to study more about this, I think you're spot on, my friend. So Alistair McIntyre wrote a book called 3 Versions of Moral Inquiry. And he looks at the history of Western inquiry, and he basically catalogs it in 3 movements. The first movement is what he calls the genealogist. And the genealogist is the person who tries to understand how things work. This is you guys. And me to a certain extent. I'm not saying it's you, but I mean, this is what scientists do. I want to understand how this works. I want to understand the rules and the knowledge and the laws and all this kind of stuff. That's the genealogist. I'm sorry, it's not the genealogist, the encyclopedist. First category, the encyclopedist. The second category is more of like the traditionalist. This is the person that he would say this is more like the religious folks. The religious folks understand that like there is truth and maybe God can reveal it, but I don't understand it perfectly, and the world is a mystery to me in some ways, and I could be wrong. The third group is sort of the writer, and this is the genealogist. This is Nietzsche. And he says Nietzsche basically looks at all these systems and says, I'm going to blow all this stuff down. None of this stuff makes sense. And I'm just going to revel in the fact that I'm destroying all of it. Right? So postmoderns would be in the tradition of Nietzsche, according to McIntyre. All right. And actually, the postmoderns, they would be honest about trading their roots to Nietzsche, too. Like Michel Foucault, he actually called himself Nietzschean. He owned it. Derrida thought of himself more as Wittgensteinian, but Wittgenstein got radicalized by reading Nietzsche. So, yeah. All right, let's keep going here. So what should Christians do? And we have plenty of time for questions here, I think, in a minute. So, well, when Christians are thinking about knowledge, we're not talking about stuff that we've figured out because we're really smart. This can be an important thing here to start with. Christian theology begins with the proposition that God speaks. It's not that we know things. We don't start there from like, hey, we know things. It starts with the proposition that God speaks. And if God has spoken, then maybe some things are knowable. So the idea that God speaks, this is the doctrine of revelation. God has spoken some things. That means that some truths are knowable to us. If God's spoken, then some things can be known. So God, and not any human culture or philosophical system, is the one who legitimates our knowledge. So if you have that true belief, that proposition P, if you have that idea and it happens to be true, the truth maker is God himself. God is the one who is kind of the legitimizer of all facts. And when you talk about truth, that doesn't mean that you're delegitimizing other cultures or other opinions. And this happens all the time. How many times do you feel like you have to apologize for your beliefs? Like, hey, I'm not trying to like disrespect you. I'm not trying to disrespect your culture or your own beliefs. This is just where I'm coming from. Well, when you talk about truth, that doesn't mean that you're trying to delegitimize somebody else's beliefs. It just means that you think that yours are correct and you have good reasons for them. You're not the one who made them legitimate. If God has spoken, then God legitimizes them. If you're wrong, then you're just out of step with whatever God says. That's what Christians would say. Christians would also say that humans are made in the image of God. This can explain the success of things like science and the growth of technology. But the idea is that if God knows the truth, then it's possible, at least for humans, to know some truths. And maybe not all things, and definitely not all things perfectly. When you say that God exists, do you know everything about what that means? Of course not. How could you understand everything about what it means for God to exist? But you still understand adequately what that means. Do you have exhaustive knowledge of God? No. Do you have maximal knowledge of God? No. But do you have sufficient knowledge of God? Adequate knowledge of God? Yeah, you do. Because you're made in God's image. If God's able to speak and be understood, then humans have the ability to speak and be understood as well. So when you do natural theology, you're doing so because you're made in the image of God. You can understand some things. Humans understand and can communicate about God's revelation. And reason is just simply a tool for doing this. This is has its foundation in Christ as the divine logos. You see this in John 1. The logos was a Greek concept of sort of the reason and foundational authority behind everything that existed. It was ultimately a rational principle. And in John 1, John, the writer of that gospel, says that Jesus is actually a personal, rational principle behind everything that exists. And so if Jesus is God, he's the divine logos, and you're made in the image of God, then you can use reason as a tool to discover at least some of the knowledge of God. So that's how Christians can do natural theology. So no, I don't think postmodernism defeats natural theology. I think postmodernism actually fails on its own terms. And I think Christian theology has a legitimate discourse about how we can understand that God exists. And the difference now is whether or not Christianity has any good arguments for the existence of God, which is what I'm not talking about tonight. But I still think it's an important thing to talk about. So thank you. I'd love to take some do some more Q&A. Happy to go whatever direction you'd like here.
Question. So I've been sort of thinking about like multiverse theory, and I'm wondering if that is sort of like an extension or a product of this postmodern philosophy, because my understanding of it, and I could be wrong, but is that it's sort of like an extension of like in our universe we have this truth, but because there's the infinite universes, there could still be infinite truths.
Yeah.
Sort of, could you comment on that?
Yeah, so I'll comment on this as a cultural philosopher, not as a cosmologist. I don't think, when I've heard scientific cosmologists talk about multiverse theory, they're making some pretty strong claims. They're trying to explain some things. I think that most of the time when people talk about multiverse theory, they're doing so in kind of a cultural setting, where they're like, well, there's could be multiple universes, right? And they do not have in mind what proponents of multiverse theory are even talking about. I think most people that refer to a multiverse are doing it in some kind of similar way to you. It's sort of like a get out of jail free card. It's like, well, of course there's the multiverse, right? Well, do we have any evidence for the multiverse? Like beyond some lame Marvel movies, did they make some enemies just now? It's like there's no evidence that it exists. That's we don't have any empirical evidence of this. We have a lot of empirical evidence of this universe, of course. Right? I always think of G.E. Moore, who said that. Here's how I know that there is such a thing as an external world. Here are two hands. If there was not an external world, there would not be two hands here. Therefore, there is an external world. I think that's actually a pretty darn good argument. But multiverse theory, I think sometimes you're right. I think it's sort of like I would like to fit in with the scientific community and virtue signal that I want to believe in science. While not having to deal with inconvenient facts. So of course there could be multiverse. Yeah. I think that's fair. That's a fair cultural critique. Yeah.
So we talked a lot about how postmodernism is self-defeating and things like that, but this is a really big question. But I'd say two parts of it. One is, where do we see postmodernism most? Goodness gracious. Where do we see postmodernism most? And then two is, why do we see it? Why do so many people subscribe to a view like this?
Yeah. So the three places I see it most are in these slogans. Speak your truth, follow your heart, to each his own. This is the gospel of our culture. Speak your truth, follow your heart, to each his own. I think so when somebody says speak your truth, what they're saying is that you have your version of the facts and you need to affirm it unashamedly. And it's a legitimate version of whatever the facts are. So it doesn't matter what empirical reality is. What is true for you is the most important thing. And speaking your truth could go to gender. It can go to your ethnicity even. People will talk about speaking their truths about being some kind of race that they clearly aren't. And it can, of course, go to your religious beliefs or your moral beliefs. To each his own is a little bit more specifically moral. If I say to each his own or to each her own, it's like the different strokes for different folks kind of way of looking at morality. It's like, hey, so for you, murdering is wrong. But, in this culture, this community, it wasn't wrong, I've actually heard people defend the Nazis this way. They're like, hey, look, they were just doing what was right for German culture at the time. Remember at Nuremberg, the Nazis were tried for violating the law above the law above the law, not for violating German law. I think that leads to nihilism. Nihilism is the idea that nothing is meaningful, nothing is good, nothing is important. Because if everything is good, then nothing is evil. And if nothing is evil, then that means that torturing an innocent person for pleasure is just as good as giving them the coat off your back to keep them warm. And that's absurd and unlivable. This is where one of the criteria for truth is that you could live it out. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. Truth must be existentially viable. That's what Doug Groothuis would say. He said truth must be existentially viable. Because if you believe something to be true, you have to be able to live it out. Well, the whole thing of to each his own or to each her own, it's ultimately not livable. And then the follow your heart thing, that seems pretty obviously false because sometimes your heart screws you up, right? Sometimes you follow your heart into perdition. You follow your heart and you end up getting your heart broken, right? If you do what feels good all the time, everybody knows that you'll probably end up dead. Right? Sometimes what feels good is the thing that will kill you. So that's where I think you see this in these ways the most in our culture. I think the reason why it's so popular, though, is there's a lot of reasons for this, but there's a really good book called Neighboring Faiths by Harold Netland that gets into this a lot more if you're interested. Harold Netland, Neighboring Faiths. Think about living in Western Europe in the 12th century. You knew about Muslims. You knew about them. Right? You probably heard the stories of how the Muslims were conquered at Tours by Charles Martel. You knew that there were Moors in Spain, but you probably didn't know any Muslims. You probably knew some Jews, but they lived in ghettos. They didn't intermarry. And you maybe had more or less respectful interactions with some of them. Okay, but maybe not. Well, think of what happens with the age of exploration. All of a sudden, you get stories of people who have vastly different beliefs than your own. And then with globalization, which is a result of the age of exploration and the rise of technology, success of science and industrialization, I'm broad brushing over hundreds of years of history here. All of a sudden, that Muslim that you may have heard of lives next door to you. Your kids play together. And you think, well, shoot, he's a really good guy. He works hard, loves his family, nice to his kids. What's wrong with the Muslims? What's wrong with these people? There's nothing wrong with them. They seem like perfectly good people. And it becomes a little bit embarrassing. This is what philosophers of religion call the scandal of particularity. Particularity is the idea that one religion is true and the others would therefore be false. It's scandalous. And it's a little bit embarrassing. Like, well, gosh, who am I to say that I'm right and everybody else is wrong? Oh, geez, I'm not sure if I want to go out on that limb. And it's embarrassing. You probably felt this way before when you talk about Christianity to people, those of you who are believers. And even if you're not, if you're a skeptical person, you may have felt embarrassed to be skeptical. Because you may have been wondering, I don't want to make a Christian feel bad for being a Christian. I don't want to embarrass them for having faith. It seems to be working for them. They seem like nice people. I think one of the things that got me when I first started working in technology was people would say things like, he's a Christian and he's a really nice guy too. And I think, well, shoot, I would kind of hope that you would think that Christian entailed nice guyness, right? But it was they were sort of surprised by all that, and I think people they get worried about what kind of interpersonal capital it would take to keep living life in a globalist society, multicultural society, if you start believing that you are correct and other people are wrong.
So it's easy to avoid conflict.
Yeah.
I guess with other people, but also with yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's good. Yeah.
So follow up on that. It's really easy for people to get comfortable with that. That's easy, non-confrontational. How do you overcome that barrier, in personal conversations or experience of getting someone to care and overcome the uncomfortability of someone?
Like if someone like you're wrong. Yeah. I usually do this by reference to moral truths that are that are really important. I've lectured about this here before. Female genital mutilation is practiced by Christian and Muslim cultures in some places in Africa, and it's wrong. And I don't care what the culture says about it. When you do that to a woman, you cause them pain for the rest of their life. You make intercourse painful, you make their monthly cycle painful, and even often everyday life is just painful. When you do that, it's always wrong. And there's never a right way to do it. Sometimes proponents of this will call it female circumcision. Oh, look, the Jews circumcise their boys, the women, or these cultures, they circumcise their women. It's not the same. So that's when you call it circumcision, you're glossing over the fact that you're causing women chronic pain for the rest of her life. Do you know why they do that, by the way? They do it so that the women are less likely to cheat on their husbands. Think about how awful that is. If you're worried about your wife cheating on you enough to mutilate her, like you're probably a bad husband. And I don't mind saying that you're a bad husband. There are bad husbands in this world. And by bad, I mean evil. And there is such a thing as evil. So that's why I talk about moral truths, because I want to get them on the same page that truth matters. There are some things that are truths, and some things that are falsities. And it matters because it matters for the woman in Africa whether or not she's going to be mutilated. It's not just like, it doesn't matter in terms of like, oh, well, hypothetically, which religion is true? I don't know. You know, it's like that could seem like it's a philosophical game, but it plays out in the world with real situations in people's lives. If you're a poor person growing up in, let's say, Palestine right now, and by that I mean Israeli-controlled Palestine, there's a legitimate pathway for you to make a lot of money for your family. To become a suicide bomber. And so their ideas have consequences. That's probably a better way to say it. That's what John Stonestreet at the Colson Center always says. Ideas have consequences. And these kinds of ideas have really bad ones. And so I always try to get to people on that level and say, like, hey, look, all this stuff we're talking about, I could be wrong. And I'm not trying to say I understand these things perfectly. And I would love to like engage you as a person on this. But I would encourage you that these things matter. And I think that's not fun because having a grave tone when you're talking about anything in our culture is not popular. And sometimes you're going to have to be the weird one. Anybody mind being a weird one at an engineering school? You're going to be the weird one, right? Hey, I study academic philosophy. I understand what it's like to be the weird one, right? Sometimes it's going to be like you're the person who's going to care about stuff and other people won't. But you know what? There'll be somebody who will. And you're going to make a big difference in their lives because you talk to them about the things that matter most. But yeah, like I even had my neighbor. My neighbor, when I moved in next to him, he told me I invited him to church and he's declined politely a couple of times. And he said, "Hey, look, my wife and I are committed atheists. We're not interested." And he said, "I don't really want to talk about this stuff a lot either." My guess is that he probably had some Christians who made him feel uncomfortable in the past. For him, I'm going to pray. I'm going to love him. I'm going to look for ways to have a conversation with him. But maybe he's not ready yet. And so today I'm just going to be a good friend, maybe try to put a stone in his shoe, try to motivate him a little bit, but I'm not going to like force my way through the door. There are other people in my life that are open, that are really ready to talk to, you know. But it's awkward sometimes. My neighbor thinks I'm a weirdo. I guess I kind of am. That's okay. And Paul says that we're peculiar people. Testament. I like that. I like that translation. That's the King James. We're peculiar people. Yeah. We care about the truth. And if you don't care about the truth, then what are you doing studying the sciences? Truth matters. It affects people's lives every day. And so yeah, I think it's probably worth having a conversation about it. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. All right. Thank you very much for having me.
I was going to mention it before, but this is Dr. Shepherdson's latest book with Grotice, who has spoke here before. He did not speak this year, so some people may not have heard of him. If you did hear him, you know he's great, and you just realized that Ike is great. And so do you want to give a summary of the book, or you want me to try and give a really bad summary?
Yeah, I would say like, so this book is called The Knowledge of God in the World and the Word. And if you've never really studied why somebody would believe that Christianity is backed up by facts, it's a good first level introduction to it. For some of the scientific evidence in this, I would say that some of the stuff is going to read pretty elementary for you. We wrote it for like the average Joe. But there's a lot of like historical evidence in there too that we get into. So it's really just kind of like, hey, I've never really studied this stuff before. I got invited to this apologetics group on campus. I don't know anything about apologetics. This is the kind of thing you could read through in a day or two and have some good questions at the end. Yeah, cool. Thanks. And my first book I put on your notes too. It's a book about postmodernism. So if you want to read more about postmodernism, I wrote a book about that too. And yeah, happy to talk about postmodernism. It's called, what is it? What is it? I just listened to a lecture. I don't really blame you for not.
That's a good answer, actually. Well,
I can't know what postmodernism is.
What's your postmodernism?
Is post-truth the same as postmodernism? Or
I think when people say that we live in a post-truth society, those people are cultural commentators. Postmodernism, I want to be clear that it's a philosophical and theological. And the success of postmodernism has kind of led us to become a culture that is unconcerned with truth. I wouldn't say that it's just postmodernism, though. I think the fact that there's been like ideological battles in our culture has made people weary of disagreements and made them sort of throw up their hands and be like, who knows? Who knows what's true? I just want to like live my life and not have anybody hurt me, you know? Well, that's asking a lot, actually, I think, you know, because it requires some insurance for you to be able to live a life and just be happy, you know, that requires some things. So yeah, I think people who talk about being in a post-truth kind of culture are typically referring to, since we've had these ideological battlefields that played out in real battlefields in the 20th century, where more people died than ever before. I want to sort of divorce myself from the truth conversation.